Look, the rising costs of health care, prescription drugs in particular, has squeezed middle-class families, forcing many to choose between their mortgage and their medicine. But despite seeing their corporate tax rate drop nearly 40% and getting an even lower rate on their foreign earnings, the drug companies have done nothing to lower the cost of prescription drugs. In fact, many have actually gone about increasing prices for some of their most profitable drugs, with one study identifying 1,300 drug price hikes this January. Pharmaceutical giants such as AbbVie announced it would increase the price of Humira by nearly 10%. Celgene hiked up the price of two of its cancer drugs by 9% each. Indeed, rather than investing their multi-billion-dollar windfall back to their customers and workers, the top 5 pharmaceutical companies have announced $45 billion in stock buybacks that disproportionately benefit corporate CEOs and very wealthy shareholders. Pfizer announced a $10 billion stock buyback late last year. Celgene gave their CEO and shareholders a $5 billion Valentine's Day gift this February 14th, and AbbVie doubled that amount a day later. So, Professor Kamen, do you see any indication that this trend will change? Do you believe that the $1.5 trillion corporate tax break will considerably reduce prescription drug prices?
Given what was in this bill, I don't see any reason to think that this would have an effect on prescription drug prices to try to reduce them. I think there are other reforms that might, but that was not in this bill.
But they could have used some of the benefits that they received to do exactly that, could they not?
I suppose a corporation could. Given the incentives created by this bill, I don't know any reason to expect that they would.
Yeah, and the incentives were basically to go to the bottom line.
So I think the immediate effect, and I think most economists would agree, the immediate effect of a corporate rate reduction is to most benefit the owners of the company, and that seems to be what we're seeing.
So I want to follow up on my colleague, who is normally very mild-mannered in the way in which he approaches things. But if there's one thing that gets him really upset with young children, is the future of what it means in terms of the debt we're hanging over the next generation. So I appreciate his passion in this regard. You know, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office came out with an updated projection showing that the Trump tax bill will add nearly $2 trillion to the national debt over 10 years. This is contrary to what our Republican colleagues promised the American people, that the corporate tax cuts would pay for themselves. Now, Dr. Holseek, and I appreciated your brutal honesty on this topic, when you acknowledged that it would add to the debt, and the debt, as a general issue, is a big problem we have to tackle, and I appreciated the remarks you made. But when you were asked about how we should address our deficits, you did not suggest closing tax loopholes or asking the very wealthy to pay their fair share. Instead, you called for cuts to Medicare and Social Security. You said, quote, if you want to solve the budget problem, and you must, you have to look at those programs, Medicare and Social Security. So could you give us a an estimate of how much we'd have to cut benefits for Medicare and Social Security to get out of this fiscal mess?
I'd be happy to get it back to you. I won't do it off the top of my head. I mean,
but it would be significant.
We are in a significant hole. The baseline budget outlook at the start of 2017 had $10 trillion of deficits over the next 10 years prior to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It's now larger. It's 12. The ones that were there to begin with were entirely driven not by tax policy, but by the spending side, and that's why it has to be under consideration.
Finally, Mr. Kamen, your testimony notes that the cost of the Trump tax bill made permanent is equal to the Social Security Trust Fund's entire shortfall for the next 75 years. Put another way, if Republicans had simply taken the trillions of dollars this tax bill costs, and instead of giving it away to corporations, used it to fix Social Security, the Social Security Trust Fund would be fully solvent for the next 75 years. Can you connect the dots and paint a picture of what the bill means for millions of middle-class families that rely on Social Security and Medicare to live out their retirement in dignity?
So I think it's important to emphasize that our key commitments to programs like Social Security and Medicare can be financed. Social Security is expected to rise in terms of its cost from about 4% of the economy for a few years ago to about 6%, and they're stabilized. Assuming we get health cost growth under control, which is essential, Medicare would actually be expected to do something similar. The question is whether we are willing to raise the revenue enough to pay for those kinds of key commitments. If we don't, and we end up cutting revenues by about 1% of GDP, which is about the size of this tax cut, and the 75-year shortfall in Social Security is about 1% of GDP over the next 75 years, then we will not be able to keep those kinds of commitments and also provide the services and investments that are so important for low and middle income Americans. So I really think there is a key trade-off here. How much revenue are we willing to raise, especially from the top, in order to try to preserve these kinds of commitments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.